talk about kind of the weather and the fire outlook for the next year or so. So I'm just going to turn it over to Dan, and then we'll have some other speakers after Dan's finished. Okay.
Yay, Dan!
I'm a fuel specialist with the U.S. Forest Service here in Ruidoso at the Smoky Bear Ranger District. And this is kind of a side dish. These guys have the main course for tonight, but this is the time of the year most of the folks that I work with are looking to what the weather patterns are and speculating what the fire season is going to be like. So I figured, well, you know, let's do a little quick presentation on that and then go into, regardless of whether it looks like it's going to be really busy or somewhat slow, there's always a chance around here because this is New Mexico. The weather changes really quick. There's always a chance if you're not having a fire one day, you're having a flood that night or something. So we'll get into the meat of it in a little bit, but kind of want to touch base on some stuff that you all might be aware of. I'm sure everybody watches the weather on the news. This is a little bit different. We have meteorologists, weather geeks, crunching numbers and watching weather patterns all the time for us with the Forest Service and BLM and Department of Interior. So they're always looking at the weather patterns and what that means for us out on the landscape. So I figured I'd start off with last year's the predictive services, what they thought last year was going to be like, and then they go through and show us what really happened with fire season, where the big fires were, and why things weren't exactly what they thought they would be like. And then I'll go into a PowerPoint and talk about what the forecast is looking like for this year. You guys know the weatherman is never 100% correct, but it's good. They do a lot of number crunching and they come up with some good estimates. They don't just pull that out of thin air. This is about almost 6 minutes. We'll watch on last year's fire season, and then we'll get into what's forecasted for this year. Okay.
We were expecting 2013 to be an epic fire season due to drought, lack of precipitation, and volatile fuel conditions. But fire danger decreased due to some late spring storms and a strong summer monsoon in the southwest.
Going into fire season 2013, conditions that we have been seeing over the previous couple of years and the very rapid drying conditions we saw beginning of the year in the west, we expected to see a fairly significant fire season, particularly across the west coast states. Going up into December, we had pretty good precipitation across the west, good snowfall across the Sierras and into the Missouri Mountains. Something happened in January where everything just kind of shut off. We were seeing huge deficits that, as we headed into the spring months, were going to be very critical to the kind of fire season that we want to get. So areas like Colorado and Wyoming, where they had a pretty good snowpack, it was gone pretty quickly, and so they were starting out in very warm and dry conditions early in the spring. That's when we started seeing fires developing in Brooklyn, Colorado.
The Black Forest fire started on June 11th in Black Forest, Colorado. It burned 14,200 acres, destroyed over 500 homes, and resulted in 2 civilian fatalities. This was the most destructive wildfire in Colorado's history.
Moving into the summer months, June, July, and August, which is the core of the western fire season, we were already starting with some very dry conditions across most of the west. The global circulation pattern is fairly neutral, so we didn't have a clear signal about what kind of weather patterns we would see throughout the summer. What we ended up seeing, though, was a very defined split between very warm and dry conditions in the west, and very cool and wet conditions in the east. As we continued to move into the summer, we had some fires developing across the southwest that, while they weren't extremely large fires, they were difficult fires to deal with because of the extremely dry fuel conditions there. Meanwhile, up in Alaska, the same very warm and dry conditions that were affecting the western United States were also affecting Alaska in very unusual ways. They were seeing near record temperatures across
This resulted in the highest wildland firefighter death toll since 1933.
As we got into August, we were starting to see a lot of fire across the northwestern United States that, while weren't tremendously big fires as we've seen in previous years, they were significant, and in some cases they were threatening communities, producing a lot of smoke, and just generally creating a significant fire problem over a period of time. As we got into mid to late September, a significant amount of rainfall had occurred across the west, and we're quickly putting the fire season to an end. There were some very dry conditions across California that we've been monitoring all year, but they never had any significant weather events that would drive a lot of fire until we got into September. The extremely dry conditions down around southern parts of California led to the Rim Fire, which was the largest fire of the season.
The Rim Fire started August 17th near Yosemite National Park. This wildfire, California's third largest, burned almost 260,000 acres and was contained on October 24th.
At the end of the season, we only had just over 40,000 fires across the U.S., which is about 2/3 of our normal, and burned just over 4 million acres, which is just a little bit more than half of what we normally see in the fire season. A lot of this was largely due to the fact that some of the interior fires, the Great Basin fires, they are oftentimes very large acre fires, didn't materialize this year for a couple of reasons. The extended drought conditions across the interior west, while producing very extreme fire conditions, we did not have the fuel loadings that typically carry a lot of fire. Another factor was during the core of the fire season, June, July, and part of early August, we didn't have a lot of lightning events in areas where we typically see a lot of lightning starts. We also didn't see a lot of acreage and fires in the southeast, where we often get a lot of fires, but not a significant amount of acres.
Although 2013 was a below average year in terms of fires and acres burned, it is important to note as we move into the 2014 season that a slow season can be just as hazardous as a busy one.
Okay. So I know it was a little bit hard to hear, but basically, to summarize, they were expecting a pretty busy fire season last year based on the 2 seasons before, especially 2012. And we were part of that really big fire season with the Little Bear Fire, and we had some other big fires in New Mexico, and of course Colorado. And it was really looking to set up that way. You know, they had a really big and very destructive fire in Colorado early on. So they were really expecting that to happen. One of the things for us that kind of kept it less likely to have a big fire season like 2012 was, although we did have some monsoon rains after the Little Bear Fire, which helped greatly when we put seed down after the fire and the seed took and held the soil, it was a fairly weak monsoon, so it didn't, which was kind of fortunate in a way, it didn't wash all the soil off the mountains. But it also didn't allow for as much growth of the fine fuels, the grasses. So we didn't have as much grass as we had in 2011, which was a big grass fire year, and 2012, where all the timber was really dry and lots of logs on the ground that were dry and susceptible to increased fire intensity. So last year, we still had some drought, so the logs and the sticks and branches in the woods were still fairly dry, but we didn't have a lot of grasses, which a lot of times with starts, that's what's going to get it started and carry the fire and get it big and difficult to control. Now this year, while we look back at last monsoon season, we didn't have a lot of huge fires, and then we went into more of a normal monsoon that we hadn't seen since probably 2010, I think. But we look at all the grass out there, and we haven't had much of a winter either, so that grass hasn't been mushed down, it's standing tall, and it's continuous. So right now we're looking a little bit worse worse off than we were than last year, because we've got all those grasses standing tall that are gonna take if we have a start to a fire, it could get big fairly quickly with the wind on it. We always have wind in the spring, don't we? So, our outlook for that is a little bit worse than it was last year. Although last year I was a bit nervous, coming out of 2012, fire season was pretty bad. I expected more of the same, just like the predictive services were. But part of it was we didn't have those grasses and fine fuels as much as we had in the past, and as much as we do have now. So let me jump into this PowerPoint. It's got a lot. It's kind of a busy looking. Some maps and graphs, and I'll go through it and try to get out the important stuff. Our predictive services folks, they look at, for us in Region 3, and a lot of the maps will be Region 3. It shows Arizona, New Mexico, and the western part of Texas, and that's what our region is. So when they talk about the region and the eastern part of the region, they're talking about us. They look at 5 major things. The first one is drought and the drought's impact on the landscape and the live and dead trees. Fine fuels condition. Fine fuels, that's grass and pine needles and oak leaf litter, stuff like that. Mostly grass and needle cast. And then, like I said, that carries a lot of weight, depending on if we have a lot of grass out there like we do now, or last year we didn't have so much of it, so it kind of gives that's going to feed the fire to get big quick. Third one is seasonal temperature and precipitation, and then we have the spring and early summer weather patterns, which our weather is tracking, and finally our monsoon. We're going to have a wet monsoon, a fairly weak monsoon. Is it going to start early or late? It's going to be somewhat of a weak monsoon, but have a lot of lightning in it to cause fires. So those are the 5 major things. So we'll get into what they're looking at. This first slide shows what their outlook, our regional folks were looking at last year. And they always try to put on the map like where it's going to be normal or above normal chances for big fires. And it might be a little bit hard to see, but they did a pretty good job. There's a bunch of these little dots here that show fires that got to a significant size, and most of them are actually within what they predicted would be the above normal chances for significant fires. So they base this on those 5 factors, and they're looking at it, and they'll tell us what part of the region is more likely to have big fires. Some years it's going to be the lowlands and grass fires. Some years it's the high country, and then some years it's the eastern or western portion, more like Arizona compared to New Mexico. Sometimes the monsoon setup where we get a real wet monsoon in New Mexico, in Arizona doesn't get much of anything but lightning, and sometimes that's reversed. So you can see they did a pretty good job. There's a few fires out here that got to significant size. They're outside of what they were predicting to be above normal, but overall they did a pretty good job. And then the same thing down here, the May through July, they did the same thing. And here's the above normal, and most of the significant fires were within that. There's one out here to the northeast, and then a couple out here to the west. So they're pretty accurate as far as giving a trend of what to expect. So for the drought, for this year, for us, and these colors are a little bit washed out on the screen, but basically, let's see. We've got kind of the darker colors are more significant for drought. And you guys have heard in the news a lot about California, right, being in a drought, and then the most severe. Actually, what they call exceptional drought is that darkest color. And then for us in New Mexico, it's mostly, they're calling it the severe drought with some parts of extreme drought. So we had a really good monsoon season, but that wasn't enough to counteract the drought that we've been in for a couple of years. And then we went into a really dry winter. We haven't had much snow at all. and it hasn't really stayed on the ground for very long. A lot of it's evaporated, not so much melted into the soil so much as it's evaporated. So we're still in we're looking, and this is February 4th, and we're looking that we're still in a severe drought and in some parts of extreme drought in our neck of the woods, in our part of New Mexico. The drought outlook calls for the drought is going to persist, develop, or worsen through the spring. Long-term drought impacts now is semi-permanent in our outlook. And then the best they're talking about hoping for is temporary mitigation of drought impacts due to weather periods, like what we just had. We got some good snow, like 10 inches of snow, I think, up on the ski mountain. Got a few inches of rain and snow lower. So it helped, but it's really just a temporary help, really. It's not going to counteract our drought, but it's more of a temporary fix. And they're looking at increased severity of volatility during fire season. And that's just because with the drought, your big logs, your sticks, your branches that are on the ground, they take a long time to absorb moisture. So having a weekend of rain is really good to kind of cool things off, get in a little bit into soil. The grasses will kind of absorb some of that moisture temporarily. The logs will absorb very little. It takes them a long time to absorb moisture. So if we get a storm come through, drop some rain, drop some snow in this early part of spring, it'll kind of have that temporary effect. But then a lot of times for us, what comes before and after is the wind. So the winds tend to dry it out very quickly. So there's a little bit of a temporary relief, but overall we're looking at staying within this drought system. For the fine fuels, we're looking at substantial periods of normal precipitation from last year's monsoon. So that's kind of just reiterating what I just said earlier. So we've got normal to above normal fine fuels out there, mostly the grasses. The grass grew really great. It's waist high in a lot of places, and now it's all cleared out. And again, if we had a bunch of snow where it was just mushed down on the ground, it wouldn't carry fire like it will now. But basically, a lot of it's standing tall and really good for carrying fire. So we've got that's a big factor right there. You see here parts of southeast Arizona and southwest Texas were drier, which results in less grass. So the good part, I guess the good side of a drought is you get less grass growing and less grass fires. But for us, we got plenty of grass growing around Lincoln and Otero County. Temperature and precipitation, this is showing December through January. And the temperature for us, this is average temperature, departure from average. So we're like about average or a few degrees above average for our area. And then for precipitation, we were well below. So these darker colors are like 5 to 25% of average. And then as far as this is snowpack over here, and those colors are, for the most part, less than 25% and some 25 to 58% of average snowpack. And you can see it doesn't get up to about normal until you get into some green up in Colorado there. But we're pretty low on snowpack. So I think Chuck kind of dubbed this La Nada. We're talking always like, are we going into El Nino? He calls it La Nada. It's just kind of like in between. Here's the jet stream pushing our storms, and this is kind of what has been happening. Most of the time, it'll drop down in the southeast even, and then come up for the eastern states. Been getting a nice winter. They're pretty tired of it by now.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't do that, it'll still stay north of our whole region and just come straight across into the mid-Atlantic states. So they've been getting the real cold temperatures and getting the real big snowfalls. And it's just been riding, just north of Arizona and New Mexico, and not dropping down until a little ways into maybe Oklahoma and parts of eastern Texas before swimming back up. And then the precipitation is the same. We really missed most of it, which a lot of our years we do tend to. Everybody that lives around here, if it does track, sometimes it'll track the northern part of Arizona from Flagstaff and then stay above Albuquerque. Whereas we'll get a little bit of moisture and we'll get a lot of wind with it. So it's kind of, in a way, normal. And you'll see in this, sometimes we talk about normal and we'll put in quotes. So even normal for us is kind of, you always want to be heads up, because normal for us is usually kind of high fire danger this time of year. So there's summery, nice little summery dry. Overall, our temps were a little bit above normal. Didn't get real cold, and then mostly the dry factor. Okay, their outlook for March through May for temperature and precipitation. We're looking at the west coast ridge shifting west into Pacific and polar vortex weakening and shifting northwest, but that's not really impacting us at all. It's still going to stay well above Arizona and New Mexico coming across, and the same thing with the precipitation. So we're just basically staying the same. Dry, warm, breezy pattern for the southwest area. Focus of warmth, dryness, and windiness probably over the eastern half of the area with downslope winds. So the eastern half of our region is basically New Mexico. So pretty typical spring for us is what they're looking at. Overall, they're thinking it's going to be warm, dry, and breezy. A few systems trying to drop towards western Arizona before moving east will bring some temperature, moisture variability to mainly the northern and northwest portions of the area. So again, sometimes we get those occasional storms pass through and they'll drop down, but they're talking about hitting a little bit in northwestern Arizona, and they don't mention, sometimes they'll drop across northern New Mexico, but they don't mention that here. But for our neck of the woods, not looking like anything's going to drop far away. So the spring and early summer weathering pattern, moderate west to northwest flow with storm systems trending to pass north of the region onto the east and southeast trajectory. So again, it's a little bit of a busy thing, but it's basically going to stay, there we are. It's basically the sideline is going to stay north of the region. So they're looking at continuing to any kind of weather pattern to stay north of us. So it'll be the warm, dry, breezy conditions will prevail. There is some variability here, talking about there is some possibility of periodic coolness, moisture, perhaps not as much as the last 2 years, or perhaps not as much as the last 2 years. So that'd be kind of like this last weekend. We got some moisture, we got some rain, we got some snow up on the mountain, but it's they're not counting on that being a trend or a real pattern, just a little exception to the rule, basically. Okay, so they have two scenarios. More likely frequent impacts here, mild, warm, very dry, breezy to windy, the strongest, most frequent winds eastern half, that's in New Mexico. And you can see that's the windy dry tendency, and here's us. So any variability is going to stay north of Arizona and New Mexico. And then they're less likely infrequent impact. It's still generally dry and breezy. And if you look at the red arrow, that's the warm dry tendency. It still cuts through New Mexico where we're at. So either one of these, the more likely or less likely, gives us their forecast is basically the same for us. Warm, dry, and windy. And then this just kind of gets a little bit more involved. I won't get into this much. and we're getting into early summer. You know, the further we get in late April through late May, they add more variability in there, but it's some possibility of cooler, moist stuff coming through, but the overall trend is the same. I'll kind of go through that quick. As far as the monsoon season, they have low confidence right now, so they don't know if it's going to be El Nino or La Nina, so they keep calling it La Nada. For right now, as we get closer, they'll be a little bit, be able to predict a little bit better. I have seen stuff on the internet. Some scientists are coming up, they've been studying the patterns, and some scientists believe they can forecast out El Nino a little bit better, and I've heard some people talking about higher chance for El Nino later in this year. But whether that materializes for us, our regional folks are they're not so confident yet. The best they can say is they're looking at possibly a normal monsoon, is the best they can say. They think it'll be close to normal like last year, not as bad as 2011, 2012, for being dry. So here's some of the summary. So for drought, basically we're in the boat of, we're not really redeveloping because we stayed in drought, except for our good monsoon season for a couple months. So it's basically going to be worsening in our area. So the thing with that is our heavy dead down logs, our dead trees are really dry, and when they burn, they're going to give off a lot more heat and burn a lot more severely and more intensely. And then our live trees are stressed, or somewhat stressed, because they're pretty dry as well, and more likely to have crown fires. The fine fuels, like we've mentioned, we've got a lot more grass out there than we have. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet is a spring green up. Sometimes we get a real nice spring green up. The last one I remember we had was in 2010. In the springtime, we got some real green grass out there, and we actually were doing some prescribed burns in the spring. I've seen very little of that, and I don't think we have enough moisture to really have a real, what you call real green up. I mean, just along a few drainages and along the roads, but nothing that's going to counteract all the dry, cured grass that's standing. So our fine fuel conditions in our drought is the same. We've got really good high potential for significant fires. The seasonal temperature and precipitation, 3 and 4, these two, they're a little bit less confident because they're forecasting out, but generally it's been definitely drier and at least normal, or a little bit warmer than normal, and they're predicting it to be the same for the spring and early summer. And in monsoon, they don't have any strong indications either way. But our major factors right here are the 1 and 2, leading us to high probability for fires to get large and be more destructive and harder to control. So most all the factors up until recently have pointed to above normal fire season potential and potentially earlier onset area-wide here. It's the same thing, so we got plenty of the grass, persistent drought, and then after a warm, dry winter and early spring, we're looking for some more wind, warm, breezy weather to make conditions worse. However, they do make the remark that there could be some of this, some conditions, we should flip in the conditions towards less severe spring. So we could have enough of this stuff like we had this weekend, even if we're not actually getting rain, just having some occasional cloud cover and harsh humidities could be just enough that's keeping fires that might ignite on a day from getting large. We've had a couple just recently that for whatever reason it's been a cool day but kind of breezy but sheltered where the fire started. That allowed people to get on top of it and catch it at like a